Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in the South China Sea. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that I recently posted a video talking about the rising tension, particularly between the Philippines and China. China is claiming the vast majority of the South China Sea, despite the fact that international law states that every country should have a 200-mile exclusive economic zone beyond the coastline into the water. But China doesn't recognise that and has claimed the vast majority of the ocean for itself, and that's causing problems with regards to fishing rights and also incursion of territory that countries deem to be their own. And in today's video we're going to talk about the latest development whereby China have actually laid a floating barrier in the water around 120 miles from the coastline of the Philippines. Now the Philippines are not at all happy about this, so they've now gone ahead and removed that barrier, and China is not at all happy about that response. So I'll have a look at exactly what's happened with regards to this floating barrier. We'll then have a look at some of the other latest conflicts that have taken place between the Philippines and China, and particularly around their sunken warship, which China is very unhappy about. We'll then talk about the ongoing developments in the relationship between the USA and the Philippines. The USA has access to 9 military bases in the Philippines, which are close to both China and Taiwan, which China is also very unhappy about. And there are now in discussions to extend that relationship to add another 4 military bases. So as the tension with China is rising, we're starting to see a closer relationship between the Philippines and the USA. I'll then go on to talk about the rising tension between the USA and China in the South China Sea. We'll have a look at some footage from US military planes which shows engagement between the two sides. We'll then have a look at why there is a dispute over the South China Sea, and particularly SCARBOROUGH Shoal, which is very close to the Philippines. And finally today I'll wrap up with my summary. So what I think is likely to happen in this area over the course of the next 3 to 6 months, and what the risks are for the global economy. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say thank you so much for all the great comments that you've been posting below. Please keep those coming. And if you would like to see more videos like this, please check out my Patreon channel, where you'll find other videos that are not being posted on YouTube, as well as having complete freedom from any ads. But if you don't like Patreon and you'd like to support the channel, please have a look in the description below, where you'll find links to YouTube's super thanks and membership, as well as buymeacoffee.com.
The Philippines on Sunday accused China's Coast Guard of installing a floating barrier in a disputed area of the South China Sea. Footage released by the Philippine Coast Guard showed several Chinese vessels near the barrier, which Manila says is preventing Filipinos from entering and fishing in the area. A spokesperson said the Philippine Coast Guard and the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources strongly condemn the installation of the barrier in part of the Scarborough Shoal. China claims 90% of the South China Sea, overlapping with the exclusive economic zones of Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Beijing seized the Scarborough Shoal in 2012, forcing Filipino fishermen to travel further for smaller catches. They were allowed to return as bilateral relations improved markedly under the Philippines' then-President Rodrigo Duterte. But tensions have mounted again since his successor, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., took office last year. The Philippine Coast Guard and Fisheries Bureau personnel discovered the floating barrier on a routine patrol on Friday. China's embassy in Manila did not immediately respond to a request for comment.
The Philippines were extremely unhappy about the installation of the floating barrier and stated that it was a violation of international law, and that Manila would take all appropriate measures to protect the country's sovereignty and the livelihood of its fishermen. Hours after the National Security Advisor had vowed to take action, the Philippines Coast Guard said it had removed the floating cordon at the behest of President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and his special task force. An official statement said the barrier posed a hazard to navigation, a clear violation of international law. It also hindered the conduct of fishing and livelihood activities of Filipinian fisherfolk. China's foreign ministry made no direct mention of the floating barrier, but defended the actions of its Coast Guard as necessary measures after a Philippine Bureau of Fisheries vessel intruded into its waters recently.
A dispute between China and the Philippines over a sunken warship has heated up. Footage released by the Chinese Coast Guard shows its ship spraying a Philippine vessel with a water cannon in what Beijing described as a warning to Manila. The Philippine vessel had been carrying supplies to a grounded warship in a disputed area of the South China Sea. The warship, which dates back to World War II, is used by the Philippines as a military outpost. It was purposely grounded in 1999 to reinforce Manila's sovereignty claims in the Spratly archipelago. Beijing wants the ship to be towed away, but Manila remains defiant.
We continue to assert our territorial rights in the face of all of these challenges and consistent with the international law and UNCLOS especially.
In response, China's foreign ministry released a statement reiterating its request for the warship to be removed, adding that its, quote, goodwill and sincerity on the issue had been ignored. Saturday's incident is just the latest in a long list of complaints Manila has lodged against China. In February, the Philippines accused Chinese coast guards of using a laser to try to disrupt another resupply mission to its troops. China claims sovereignty over almost the entire South China Sea, which overlaps with the waters of Malaysia, Vietnam, Brunei, Taiwan, and the Philippines.
I have always said that it seems to me that the future of the Philippines, and for that matter the Asia Pacific, will always have to involve the United States.
In a clear statement that relations between the Philippines and the USA are strengthening, the Philippines have announced that it's identified 4 additional military bases that the USA can gain access to, in addition to the 9 bases that the USA can currently access. This map shows the 9 military bases that the Philippines opened up to the USA as part of the 2014 Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement between the two nations. As you can see from the map, the military bases are spread across a wide geographic area, which potentially enables the USA to provide full coverage of the whole of the Philippines. But the bases that have caused most concern in China are those located on the island of Luzon, which are closest to the disputed island of Taiwan. And 3 of the 4 additional bases that the USA and the Philippines are in discussion over are also located close to Taiwan, and the other is close to the disputed area of the Spratly Islands.
China's vast territorial claims rejected by the U.S. and others. This is a huge area. You're talking about 1.3 million square miles. And China is claiming much of it, islands and waterways that are vital to trillions of dollars in international trade, travel, and communications. The U.S. Navy has been stepping up their so-called freedom of navigation operations, flying planes and sailing warships very close to those disputed islands. And for years, China has been warning the U.S. to back off.
The plane is headed past the self-governing island of Taiwan, which China claims as its own, to the South China Sea, which China also claims almost all for itself, ignoring competing claims from countries like Vietnam and the Philippines. Some 30 miles from the Chinese-occupied PARACEL Islands, a Chinese voice crackles over the radio.
American aircraft, this is the PLA Air Force. You are approaching Chinese airspace. Keep a safe distance or you'll be intercepted.
That's when the Chinese People's Liberation Army fighter jet appears, flying so close you can see the pilots in their cockpit.
PLA fighter aircraft, this is U.S. Navy P-8 on VHF 121.5. I hold you off my left wing and I intend to continue to proceed to the west.
The Chinese pilot never responds, but eventually leaves when the U.S. plane turns south. The plane spots a Chinese guided missile destroyer.
U.S. aircraft. This is Chinese Navy warship. You are approaching me. Keep safe distance away from me. Over.
I'm a United States military aircraft and I will remain a safe distance from your unit.
A cat-and-mouse game between 2 rival militaries in one of the most hotly contested regions in the world. Commodore Will Torreson shows the network of man-made islands China built on what had been coral reefs claimed by other countries.
Our number one focus here is to ensure that we have continued access alongside all of our allies and partners to international airspace and international waters.
The U.S. presence here aimed at preventing further encroachment by China.
X-ray Charlie copies, no worries.
This map of the South China Sea shows the 6 countries that have laid claim to the sea, being China, Taiwan, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei and Vietnam. And as you can see, the South China Sea sits between all of these different countries. And you can see that there's a lot going on this map. We've got 3 distinct island groups. The PARACEL is a small group of islands that's located towards the north of the South China Sea and is closest in proximity to both Vietnam and China. The SCARBOROUGH Shoal Islands are located close to the Philippines, and the SPRATLYs are located closest to Malaysia. Now, if you look at this map, it's slightly confusing because we've got red lines and blue lines on it. The red lines delineate China's 9-dash line, and we'll come on to talk about that in more detail in a moment. And the blue lines here show the 200 nautical mile exclusion zone for each of the 6 countries. So if we look at Vietnam first, it's the easiest one to see. You can see the shape of Vietnam, which is shown in grey on the left-hand side of this map. And the 200-mile nautical exclusion zone matches the outline of the Vietnam coastline, apart from the section at the top where we've got sea that sits between Vietnam and China, and the blue line then moves down the middle, so it's less than 200 nautical miles from both countries. And if we move around the map in an anti-clockwise direction, you can see that there's a blue line in the middle of the sea between Vietnam and Malaysia. We've then got a delineated section for Brunei, which is a very small country that's located along the coast that Malaysia actually sits around. So you can see there's a rectangular section for the Brunei section. We've then got a separation of the sea between Malaysia and the Philippines. We've got a 200-mile exclusion zone around the Philippines. And then as we move around to the top, we've got a 200-mile exclusion zone around China and Taiwan. And obviously there is a dispute ongoing between China and Taiwan. China does not recognise Taiwan as an independent country. It believes Taiwan is actually part of China, but obviously the Taiwanese rulers believe that they are an independent nation. And then right in the middle of this ocean, you can see where the words PARACEL, South China Sea and SPRATLYs are written on this map. We've got a zone that's in no man's land, that's basically outside of the 200-mile nautical mile exclusive exclusion zone that was created by the UNCLOS agreement. So basically what this map shows is that if we were following the UNCLOS agreement, we would have a very clear delineation as to who owns what in terms of the sea, and therefore who's got the fishing rights and who has the exclusive rights to any oil and gas that was discovered in the land sitting underneath the sea. However, the reason that there is a South China Sea dispute is that China has laid claim to the vast majority of these waters. The 9-dash line that's sitting close to all of the countries on this map was drawn up by China following the end of World War II and basically shows the whole of the area that China has laid claim to. And the history of the 9-dash line dates back to 1947, when the government of the Republic of China first published a map laying claim to the vast majority of the South China Sea. Now, interestingly, at that time, there were 11 dashes on the map. However, 2 were subsequently removed due to improving relations between China and North Vietnam, so it became a 9-dash line. Now, the 9-dash line has never been ratified by any of the other countries. They do not agree with China that it owns the vast majority of this ocean, and that's where this dispute has arisen. Ever since China published the 9-dash line, there has been rising tension between the 6 nations who all claim rights for the South China Sea. And over the course of the last 50 years, some of that tension has boiled over into physical conflict. The PARACEL Islands in the north of the sea are an archipelago which includes around 130 small coral islands and reefs, which are distributed over a maritime area of around 5,800 square miles and have a land area of approximately 3 square miles. So this is a really small group of islands, but interestingly the archipelago includes Dragon Hole, which is the deepest underwater sinkhole in the whole of the world. Turtles and seabirds are native to the islands, which have a hot and humid climate, abundant rainfall and frequent typhoons, and the archipelago is surrounded by productive fishing grounds and a seabed with potential but as yet unexplored oil and gas reserves. In January 1974, the dispute over the PARACEL Islands exploded into warfare. It was reported that the Chinese Navy had laid claim to the islands, and the government of South Vietnam sent a unit of frigates to the area to defend the land. On the 19th of January 1974, there were sea and land battles between Chinese and Vietnamese forces, with casualties reported on both sides. However, at the end of the conflict, the Chinese fleet defeated the naval force of South Vietnam, and China claimed control of the entire archipelago. This proved to be a significant turning point from China's perspective. However, the sovereignty dispute of the islands remains unresolved with Vietnam. The official death toll was reported as being more than 70 from Vietnam's perspective. However, no figures were ever released by China. China subsequently established a population of more than 1,000 people, the majority of which live on the main island of Woody. And earlier this year, it was announced that a hot pot restaurant had been opened on the island, which can seat up to 120 people at a time. The Spratly Islands are an archipelago comprised of islands, islets, cays and more than 100 reefs, which lie off the coasts of the Philippines, Malaysia and South Vietnam. The islands are largely uninhabited, but offer rich fishing grounds and may contain significant oil and natural gas reserves, and as such are important to all of the claimant countries in their attempts to establish international boundaries. Some of the islands have civilian settlements, but the vast majority of the 45 islands that contain structures are occupied by military forces from Malaysia, China, the Philippines and Vietnam. In addition to this, Brunei has claimed exclusive economic zone in the southeastern part of the Spratly Islands, which includes the uninhabited Louisa Reef. Japan occupied some of the islands in 1939 during World War II and used them as a submarine base for the occupation of Southeast Asia. However, following Japan's defeat at the end of World War II, China reclaimed the entirety of the Spratly Islands, and it was at this time that the 11-dashed line map was created. In 1987, China installed a small military structure on Fiery Cross Reef under the pretext of building an oceanic observation station. And after a deadly skirmish with the Vietnamese Navy, China installed more military structures on more reefs in the vicinity of the Philippines and Vietnamese occupied islands. And this led to escalating tensions between these countries and China over the status and ownership of the reefs. In 1988, the Vietnamese and Chinese navies engaged in a skirmish in the area of Johnson South Reef, and in 1999 a Philippine Navy ship, the Sierra Madre, was purposefully run aground near 2nd Thomas Shoal to enable establishment of a military outpost. Now interestingly, despite the fact that the population of the Spratly Islands is small, there are actually 7 different airports, which are basically just concrete landing strips which enable aircraft to be able to land and take off. 5 of these have been constructed by China, 1 has been constructed by Malaysia and 1 has been constructed by the Philippines. Scarborough Shoal is a triangular-shaped chain of reefs and rocks, covering an area of around 58 square miles with a perimeter of around 29 miles, including an inner lagoon. And this area is located around 119 nautical miles due east of the Philippines, so well within the 200 nautical miles that was established by the UNCLOS agreement. Scarborough Shoal is claimed by China under the 9-dash line, and in 2013 the Philippines filed an international case against China in the arbitration court, and in 2016 the arbitration court of The Hague declared that China's so-called 9-dash line claim to the entire South China Sea was invalid, and upheld the sovereign rights of the Philippines to this area. China rejected the court's decision and sent warships to the area, and there have been a multitude of skirmishes between China and the Philippines over the course of the last 7 years, some of which have drawn the attention of the USA. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think what's happening in the South China Sea is really interesting, because all of the countries involved are very unhappy that China has basically cast a very wide net across the ocean and said, we have 90% of this for ourselves and you can have a very small amount of water that is close to your coastline. And the international law says that all countries should have a 200-mile exclusion zone off their coast. But China does not recognise that. It wants to take the fishing rights and potentially also all of the rights for anything that is below the ocean. So if there are any oil or gas reserves underneath the sea, China could potentially realise the value in those if it's claiming all of this area for itself. Now, as we've seen in today's video, the Philippines particularly are very unhappy about what's happening, and they've been involved in a number of different conflicts with China over the course of the last 12 months or so. And those incidents are now starting to become more frequent, and China is upping the ante. As we saw right at the start of the video, China laid a floating barrier to physically stop Philippine fishermen from being able to go and fish in those waters. Now, over the course of the last 10 years, China has actually physically taken control of some of the islands and some of the coral, and it's started to build on that coral. But what we're seeing here is China going beyond taking over actual physical land and trying to claim the sea in a physical form by putting in a barrier. Now, as you also saw, the Philippines have reacted very quickly to this. They've come out and cut that barrier. They've removed it. Now, it will be very interesting to see what China's response to this reaction by the Philippines is, and whether or not they try to reinstate that floating barrier or do something else that is going to antagonize the Philippines. And obviously, in isolation, this is a concern. But when you look at what's going on with regards to the relationship between the Philippines and the USA, that has got stronger over the course of the last year or so. The new president is very keen on teaming up with the USA. And obviously the USA is now being brought into this potential conflict. We saw from the footage that the USA already has military presence in the area, and it's using Philippine war bases to be able to have personnel on the ground. And that's causing tension between the USA and China. So we've now got a potential powder keg building up in this area. And all it will take is for China to overstep the mark once too often to cause the Philippines to have to retaliate. And that could then potentially result in some sort of retaliation from China, which could draw in the USA. So the big picture concern here is that we could ultimately end up with a situation whereby China and the USA are facing off over China's continual demands to take control of all of these waters. And if we do get to that situation, then there is a risk that we could see some sort of conflict between the two biggest countries in the world from an economic perspective. So I'll keep you posted on any further news and developments as and when they happen. Hopefully you've enjoyed today's video and found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. And here's something to put a smile on your face.